Hey guys, imagine this. You're standing in the flickering light of a tavern fire. It's late, and the smell of spilled ale, sweat, and wet straw clings to everything like a curse. Outside, rain beats against the wooden shutters, and somewhere far down the muddy road, a dog is howling. You sit there, hunched over a wooden cup, pretending not to listen as two cloaked figures whisper in the corner. One of them glances at you. You know that look, that slow, assessing, dangerous look, the kind that says, I have a job for you, but this isn't some cool spy movie moment. You're not about to leap across rooftops or vanish into the shadows. No, this is the Middle Ages. You're cold, probably sick, half-starved, and if you mess this up, you'll die in ways too creative for comfort. Welcome to the life of a medieval assassin. Now, don't picture sleek black armor or hidden blades. Think more, old leather that smells like goat, a rusty knife tucked in your boot, maybe a borrowed cloak that still has someone else's blood on it. You're not a trained killer, you're a desperate man, or woman, in a desperate time. And someone, somewhere, needs a problem to go away quietly. You'd think it paid well, right? That's what everyone assumes. But back then, assassination wasn't a career. It was a last resort, usually for someone with nothing left to lose. And even when the money was good, which was rare, it came with a curse attached. Because killing in the Middle Ages wasn't just illegal, it was spiritually suicidal. People genuinely believed that spilling blood, especially for money, doomed your soul forever. No forgiveness, no purgatory, straight to hell. And yet, the demand never stopped. Because politics, even in a world of swords and plagues, was always deadly. Let's go back in time a little. Say, to the 13th century. Europe is crawling with small kingdoms, lords, barons, and bishops, all scheming for power. Everyone wants a piece of land, a title, or a throne. And when words fail, which they often do, there's always someone willing to solve the problem for a price. That's where you come in. But before we talk about your jobs, let's talk about your reputation. You don't really exist on paper. There's no guild for assassins, no training academy tucked behind a monastery. You learn by doing. Maybe you were once a soldier who got tired of following orders. Maybe a peasant who realized there's more coin in one night's dirty work than in a year of farming. Or maybe you were part of something bigger, one of those secret orders history loves to whisper about. You've heard the stories, hooded monks with daggers, Templar traitors, Byzantine poisoners. But most assassins weren't part of any grand conspiracy. They were simply tools, hired, used, and discarded. You take the job because you need money, or revenge, or maybe you just don't care anymore. You take it knowing full well you might not live to spend what you earn. And the tools of your trade, let's just say they were about as reliable as a wooden sword. Daggers were the most common, short, easy to hide, but dull faster than you could sharpen them. A crossbow might give you distance, but reloading took forever. Poison sounded elegant until you realized half the time it just made your target throw up instead of die. You couldn't exactly stroll into a medieval market and ask for the good poison. You'd end up either arrested or on the church's watch list for witchcraft. Speaking of the church, oh boy, they hated assassins. Murder was one thing, but secret murder, that was pure evil. Kings might secretly hire you, but publicly they'd condemn you. Even priests who plotted quietly behind closed doors would spit on your name in the open. Assassins were everyone's favorite scapegoats. And yet, you'd be amazed how many of those same holy men had a little job they needed done. See, the medieval world was full of hypocrisy. One day, a lord is blessing his soldiers before battle. The next day, he's hiring someone like you to take care of a political rival, preferably before Sunday Mass. You'd meet them in the strangest places. Inside inns, behind churches, in the corner of a noisy market. Deals whispered over cups of watered-down wine. Payment made in coin, land, or sometimes a promise of protection, which, spoiler alert, usually meant nothing once the job was done. And the planning, oh, that was chaos. There were no blueprints or secret scrolls. You relied on gossip. You asked questions you shouldn't ask. You bribed a servant to leave a door unlocked. Everything depended on timing and luck. And when things went wrong, which they always did, it was never quiet. Because medieval justice wasn't about fairness, it was about spectacle. If you were caught, your employer would vanish faster than your dignity. You'd be tortured until you confessed, then executed in front of everyone as a warning. Sometimes they'd hang you, sometimes they'd quarter you, Sometimes they'd get creative, burning, boiling, or tossing you from a castle tower. It depended on how angry your target's family was. There's one recorded case in 1286, an assassin sent to kill a Scottish king. He failed the punishment. He was tied to horses and ripped apart in front of a cheering crowd. Not exactly a quiet end. And here's the worst part, even if you did succeed, you could never relax. You'd spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, sleeping with a dagger under your straw mattress, wondering if tonight's the night someone comes to return the favor. Because in the Middle Ages, loyalty was temporary. Everyone betrayed everyone, eventually. But let's step back for a moment. Picture a typical day in your life. You wake up in a cheap tavern, maybe in a town you can't even name. The bed is full of fleas, your boots are soaked, and the only thing you've eaten is stale bread and regret. You don't stay anywhere long enough to make friends. Too dangerous. Too many eyes. You spend the day watching people, learning their patterns, memorizing routes, faces, weaknesses. You become invisible. Not because of magic or stealth, but because no one wants to notice you. You blend in with the mud, the beggars, the noise of life, and when night falls, that's when you move. No light, no sound, just the creak of leather, the whisper of your breath, and the pounding of your heart. You might wait for hours in the dark, every sound a threat. The wind in the trees, the barking of dogs, the scrape of metal that might not even be real. And then, in one terrible instant, it's done. The target falls. The deed is finished. The silence afterward feels heavier than any prayer. You disappear before sunrise, leaving behind chaos and suspicion. People whisper about devils, curses, or divine punishment. No one wants to believe it was just a person. But you know, you were there. You can't wash the blood off your hands. Not really. Even if you find a stream, even if you move to another town, even if you swear to start over, it follows you, like a shadow, like a smell. Because being a medieval assassin wasn't just a job, it was a sentence. You weren't feared like a knight, or respected like a soldier. You were a ghost among the living, a reminder of everything people didn't want to admit still existed in their holy, shining, plague-ridden world. And every night, when you finally lay down on that itchy straw bed, you'd wonder the same thing. Was it worth it? Because deep down, you already knew the answer. You pack what little you own into a small bundle. A dagger, a crust of bread, maybe a coin or two if you're lucky. The streets are still wet with last night's rain. The smell of smoke and sewage thick in the air. You pull your hood low, and you walk. You don't look back. You never do. Because the first rule of surviving as an assassin in the Middle Ages was simple. Don't get attached to anything that breathes. Every town looks the same after a while. Timbered houses leaning like drunks. Chickens running loose. And beggars by the church steps. You move through them like a ghost, unnoticed and unwanted. People see you but don't really look. That's the gift of the trade, invisibility through insignificance. But every time you take a life, something changes in you. Not in a poetic way. It's not guilt, not exactly, it's more like decay. You start to rot from the inside, slowly, quietly. You notice yourself talking less, trusting less, feeling less. The things that used to matter, warmth, laughter, a decent meal, they all start to feel like luxuries you don't deserve. You keep to the shadows. You listen more than you speak. You learn to read people's faces, to sense when someone's lying or watching too closely. And you drink, not for joy, just to sleep. Because dreams, in your trade, are the worst kind of punishment. Once, maybe, you told yourself you were doing it for justice. Maybe your first kill was for a reason, to avenge a wrong, to survive, to strike back at a lord who crushed your family. But revenge burns out quickly, and all that's left is routine. You stop thinking about why. It's just something you do now. You hear stories of others like you, the shadow men, the night wolves, the dagger monks. Most are just rumors. Some are real. There are small, scattered networks across Europe. In Italy, they whisper about poisoners who serve dukes. In France, killers hidden among mercenaries. In Byzantium, eunuchs who slip blades into court rivals. There's no brotherhood, no loyalty, just coincidence and greed. Occasionally, you meet another assassin. It's never friendly. You circle each other with the kind of quiet tension animals have before they bite. You trade information, sometimes tools, sometimes lies. No one trusts anyone, not even themselves. And yet, there's a strange understanding. You're both cursed in the same way. both pretending to be part of a world that never truly sees you. You might share a drink, you might even share a fire. But when morning comes, one of you always leaves before the other wakes, because trust in your line is fatal. When the jobs come, they come suddenly. A message hidden in bread, a coin marked with a symbol, a merchant's son who fell from a window. Most of the time, your employers are powerful people, nobles, merchants, priests, who would never admit they hired you. You're a tool to them, a sin they can disown later. They talk about honor, God, and justice, but when they want a rival gone, they come to you. And you, who no longer believe in any of those things, do it. Because belief doesn't buy food. The irony, though, is brutal. Half of your targets aren't evil. Sometimes they're just inconvenient. A brother in the way of inheritance, a rival merchant, a woman who knows too much. Every time you kill, a small part of you wonders, was it worth their life, or mine? But that kind of thinking is dangerous, so you bury it deep. You learn to see death as a transaction, just business, a coin for a life. Simple, clean, only it's never really clean, is it? Blood doesn't wash off. Not from your skin, not from your soul. You see their faces in puddles, in the reflection of a cup of wine, in the eyes of strangers. Sometimes you swear you hear their voices when the wind hits just right, but you keep moving, because what else can you do? When winter comes, life gets harder, the roads freeze, food becomes scarce, people are suspicious of travelers. You can't blend in as easily. You start to take smaller, riskier jobs, petty killings, thievery, intimidation. Each one drags you a little lower, until you start wondering if you're really any different from the bandits hanging by the roadside gallows. One night, you take shelter in an abandoned barn. The roof leaks, the air smells of rot, but it's shelter. You sit by a weak fire, sharpening your blade, and you realize it's chipped. Too many uses, too little care. You run your thumb along the edge and nick yourself. A thin line of blood. It's almost poetic. The tool of death, biting the hand that wields it. You stare at the blood, and for the first time in years, you actually feel something. Not fear, not guilt, just tired, bone deep, soul rotting, tired. You wonder how long this can go on, how many more faces, how many more nights, and then you hear a voice outside, a man calling your name. You freeze. You haven't heard anyone say your real name in years. The voice is calm, too calm. You reach for your dagger, your heart hammering. It's a messenger. He carries a letter sealed with wax, an unfamiliar crest. You open it by firelight. Inside is an offer, a big one, the biggest you've ever had. Enough gold to vanish forever, enough to buy land, start over, maybe even live like a real person again. You travel for weeks, through forests, across frozen rivers, past plague-struck villages. Each step feels heavier than the last. You sleep little, eat less. By the time you reach the city, you look more ghost than man. You watch your target from a distance. A tall man, confident, always surrounded by guards. He dines in candlelight while you watch from the shadows, smelling of smoke and dirt. You wonder if he ever thinks about people like you, the invisible ones, who make his world run smoothly. Probably not. The plan is simple, at least on paper. Wait until he's at church. There, among the crowds and incense, you'll have your chance. You bribe a servant, memorize the patterns, time the bells. You rehearse every movement until it feels like instinct. When the day comes, the city is alive with sound, bells, voices, horses. You slip inside, blending with the faithful. The smell of incense is thick enough to choke on. You move closer, step by step. The dagger feels heavy, like it's resisting what's coming. And then, the moment a guard turns his head, the noble bows his head in prayer, and you strike. But fate, as always, plays tricks. Your blade catches on the fabric of his robe, just enough hesitation for him to shout. The crowd erupts. The guards grab you before you even take 2 steps. You fight, but it's useless. The blow to the back of your head comes like a hammer. When you wake, you're in chains. The dungeon smells like rot and old screams. You've seen death before, but this is worse. You know what comes next. Torture, confession, a slow, painful end. The guards laugh as they drag you out. The noble you failed to kill stands watching, safe and smug. He tells the crowd you were sent by demons, by heretics. He makes a show of praying for your soul while you're tied to the stake. The hypocrisy burns hotter than the flames ever could. As the fire rises, the pain is unbearable, but your mind drifts. You think of the first time you killed, the faces, the endless nights. You wonder if the world will remember you at all. Probably not. Assassins don't make history, they erase it. The last thing you see before the smoke takes you is the sky, grey, uncaring, infinite. And in that final instant, you finally understand why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin. Not because of the pain, or the fear, or even the fire, but because you never really belonged to the world you lived in. You were always a shadow. And shadows, no matter how long they stretch, always fade. The world doesn't stop turning just because you die. Somewhere beyond the ashes, the city carries on. The bells still ring. The same nobleman who ordered your death sits down to supper that night, tearing into roasted meat and laughing with his guests. No one mentions you by name. You've already become a ghost story, a nameless assassin, caught and burned. Another warning to the poor. But the story doesn't end there, because while one assassin dies, another is already being recruited. That's how it always worked. In the Middle Ages, death was a business, and business was booming. Nobles had their own ways of hiding dirty work. If a rival lord stood in the way, an assassin became an investment, discreet, cheap, and deniable. It wasn't always called murder, of course. They used fancy words like divine justice, political necessity, or God's will. But behind every sermon and every royal decree, someone like you was out there doing the bloody work. The higher you climbed in society, the deadlier the politics became. Kings and popes were not safe from daggers. In fact, some of them wielded invisible blades more often than swords. Take Italy in the 14th century, a land of city-states and constant betrayal. Every noble family had enemies, and every rival had someone willing to end things permanently. In Florence, in Venice, in Milan, assassination was practically an art form. Poisons brewed in monasteries, servants bribed to leave doors open, priests who heard confessions and passed secrets to the highest bidder. One evening, a duke might dine with a trusted ally, sharing bread and laughter. By morning, that same ally would be found cold in his bed, a black mark on his lips where poison kissed him goodnight. The funny thing was, no one even pretended to be shocked anymore. Everyone knew how the game was played, and everyone still played it. Because in a world where power was fragile, a knife in the dark could change the map faster than an army. But that didn't make life any easier for the assassins themselves. The powerful men who hired them saw them as disposable tools. You were never meant to live long. You were never meant to have a name. Imagine a noble sitting in a candlelit room, wearing velvet, sipping wine that cost more than your life. He listens to your report, nods, maybe even smiles. Excellent work, he says. Then he calls for his guards, and you suddenly understand. You're a loose end. Sometimes they kill you on the spot. Other times, they pay you just enough to make you leave quietly, and send another killer after you a week later. It's poetic, in a twisted way. Assassins killing assassins. Secrets burying secrets. Of course, some killers learned to play the long game. They'd demand payment up front, disappear into the countryside, and never return. Others became masters of disguise, changing names, accents, entire lives every few months. A butcher one week, a monk the next. But no matter how far they ran, the shadow of the job always followed. Because you can't kill without leaving traces, not just blood, but whispers. Someone always talks. A servant, a drunk, a rival with a grudge. Rumor spreads like plague, and sooner or later, it reaches the wrong ears. That's how the church got involved. By the late Middle Ages, the Catholic Church wasn't just a spiritual power, it was political, wealthy, and utterly ruthless. Bishops commanded armies, popes crowned kings, and when something or someone threatened that power, they didn't always wait for divine intervention. Some priests plotted like nobles. Some cardinals had assassins of their own. You wouldn't believe how many miraculous deaths of rivals turned out to be the work of well-placed poison. Yet, officially, the church condemned it all. Murder was a mortal sin, the act of the devil. So when assassins were caught, they were paraded through the streets as examples of corruption, proof that sin lived among the poor, not the powerful. You'd be dragged to the gallows, beaten, mocked, spat on. The crowd would cheer, but among them you'd often see your employer silent, hidden beneath a hood, watching you die with a calm, unreadable face. The cruelty of it wasn't just in the killing, it was in the forgetting. No one remembered assassins. They were erased on purpose. The history books never mentioned them, only the noble deaths they caused. and yet their work shaped kingdoms. An unseen dagger could alter the fate of nations. A poisoned chalice could start or end wars. The death of one bishop could shift the balance of power across Europe, all done by people who would never be remembered. It's strange, isn't it, that the most feared hands in the Middle Ages were the ones history refused to write about. Still, for every powerful man who hired an assassin, there was always someone trying to justify it. He was a tyrant, they'd say. He deserved it. Maybe they were right, maybe not. But to the man with the blade, the reason didn't matter anymore. All reasons start to sound the same when you've spilled enough blood. And here's the cruel twist. Even when assassins thought they were free, they were never really free. Because the same noble who used you could always use your secret against you. You lived on their mercy, and mercy was rare. Some killers tried to find redemption. They ran to monasteries, shaved their heads, and called themselves brothers. But no matter how many prayers they whispered, the past had claws. You can't kneel your way out of a life built on murder. Others turned to mercenary work, fighting in endless wars that plagued the continent. In those armies, killing was legal, celebrated. Even for a while, they could pretend they were just soldiers again, men of purpose, not ghosts. But when the war ended, they'd find themselves right back where they started, alone, broke, and hunted. By now, you might be wondering why anyone kept doing it, why anyone would choose this life. The truth, most didn't. Desperation chooses for you. Hunger, grief, revenge, they all lead down the same road. And once you step on it, there's no way back. Imagine being born into a world where your life is worth less than a loaf of bread, where the lord who owns your village can beat or kill you without consequence. You grow up knowing that justice doesn't exist, only power. So when someone finally offers you a way to hold power, even for a heartbeat, when someone says, "I'll pay you to make them feel what you felt," it's tempting. That's how the cycle keeps going. The powerful make monsters out of the desperate, then punish those monsters to keep everyone else afraid. It's elegant in its cruelty. The assassins' faces changed, their names lost, but the story never did. You can trace it through the years like a shadow, from the poisoned rings of Renaissance Italy to the silent blades of the Crusades, and even into the royal courts of France and England, where death came quietly behind embroidered curtains. Sometimes, it wasn't even men who did the killing. There were women too, widows, mistresses, servants, healers with vials of slow poison hidden among their herbs. They were rarely caught, because no one ever suspected them. Society didn't think women capable of such cold skill. But history has always underestimated them. A noblewoman who slipped a few drops of venom into her husband's wine could inherit everything. A servant who removed a cruel master could vanish without a trace. The line between victim and killer was thinner than a thread of silk. And yet, the ones who lived by the blade, truly lived by it, never found peace. The money never lasted. The faces never faded. Their names, when remembered, were curses whispered at night. The kings and nobles they served went on to have statues, songs, and chronicles written about them. But the assassins, they became myths, shadows that flicker in the corners of old stories, convenient villains in tales told to frighten children. You can almost hear the warning in every bedtime story. Don't stray into the dark. Don't trust the stranger. Don't make deals in the night. Because behind all those old fears was a grain of truth. There really were people who lived in the dark, who made deals in whispers, who struck when no one was watching. You'd think after a successful kill, the assassin might finally relax, go home, count their coins, maybe sip some bad ale by the fire, and pretend to be normal for a few days. But no, that was rarely the case. Because in medieval Europe, people loved to talk, and gossip could get you killed faster than any sword. Imagine trying to keep a murder secret in a small medieval village where the population is like 50 people, and half of them are your cousins. Someone always saw something. A shadow, a hood, a figure sneaking through the fog. Maybe a glimpse of that same dagger you thought no one would recognize. Before you knew it, word reached the local priest, then the bailiff, then the Lord himself. And once the Lord's guards were involved, your odds of survival plummeted. Even if you somehow avoided capture, the church didn't let up. Killing was a sin, and everyone knew it. The church's reach was everywhere, from the smallest peasant hut to the grandest castle. You could hide your face, but not your soul. That's what they told people. Many assassins, especially those who came from poor backgrounds, would carry a heavy sense of guilt. not because they had suddenly become moral philosophers, but because they genuinely believed they were doomed to eternal torment. And in the Middle Ages, hell wasn't just a metaphor, it was as real as the mud under your feet. To make matters worse, there was the constant paranoia. If your client betrayed you, that was one problem. But there were also bounty hunters, rival assassins, guards, and angry relatives of your victims, all potential threats. You might think you were the hunter, but most of the time, you were the hunted. It wasn't uncommon for assassins to die within months of their first job. Few ever made it to old age. In fact, the idea of a retired medieval assassin is kind of a joke. The only retirement plan was either hanging, beheading, or the occasional miracle of dying quietly from disease before someone found out what you'd done. And those few who did manage to survive long enough to make a name for themselves often ended up as pawns in bigger political games. Lords and kings didn't just want someone dead, they wanted control. An assassin was a tool, a disposable one. Once you'd done your dirty work, you became a liability. Too many secrets, too much risk. Some were silenced to ensure loyalty. Others were executed under false charges, just to tie up loose ends. Imagine being used to kill someone important, only for the same people who hired you to accuse you of witchcraft or treason right after. That happened more often than you'd think. And if you were ever captured, oh, things got ugly. Medieval torture wasn't about getting information quickly, it was about making an example. The rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden, hot tongs, branding irons. Creativity was endless when it came to pain. Interrogators wanted confessions, names, motives, and if they didn't get them, they made sure you screamed loud enough for the entire town to hear. Then came public execution, which doubled as free entertainment. Crowds would gather, children would climb up fences to see better, and you'd be paraded around as a lesson in why not to play with nobles' lives. The most merciful outcome was hanging. The worst, being drawn and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors, and assassins fell neatly into that category. Now, not every assassin was a lone wanderer with a dagger. Some actually worked within organizations, loose brotherhoods, or mercenary bands that specialized in delicate missions. The most famous example, of course, were the Nizari Ismailis, the so-called assassins of the Middle East. Europeans feared and mythologized them, turning them into shadowy figures with mystical powers. In truth, they were political agents, not random killers. They believed their actions served a higher religious and strategic purpose. But by the time stories of them spread across Europe, reality had been replaced by wild imagination. Suddenly, every shady killing or mysterious disappearance was blamed on the assassins. The word itself became legend and terror. Ironically, this myth ended up inspiring European rulers to create their own spies and hitmen. Kings like Edward I of England and Philip the Fair of France used secret operatives to eliminate rivals quietly. But those agents weren't respected either. They were considered dishonorable, because real warriors fought face-to-face on the battlefield. Sneaky killing was cowardly, sinful, and shameful, unless you were doing it for God or the crown, in which case, people conveniently looked the other way. Even in cities like Venice or Florence, where politics were as dangerous as daggers, assassins had short careers. Renaissance Italy was practically a playground for intrigue. Poisonings, ambushes, staged accidents, you name it. Someone tried it. But even the most careful killers often fell victim to the same game they played. A successful assassination might win you praise one day, but by the next week, your employer might decide you knew too much. Poison was the most common way to clean up those loose ends. Imagine spending your life perfecting the art of silent killing, only to die from a spiked cup of wine in the end. And then there were the accidents. Because medieval life itself was dangerous enough, you could spend weeks planning a kill, only to get food poisoning from spoiled meat the night before, or get bitten by a rat carrying the plague. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no clean water. One infected cut from your own dagger could end your career faster than any sword. It's almost poetic, the killer undone by the smallest wound. Yet, despite all this misery, there were always people willing to do it, because desperate times create desperate choices. For a starving soldier or a homeless peasant, a single job might mean survival, even if it also meant eternal damnation. In that way, assassins were reflections of the age itself, brutal, uncertain, and haunted by fear. And fear was the true currency of the Middle Ages. Fear of the church, fear of punishment, fear of disease, fear of poverty. The assassin's life was built entirely around it, using fear, surviving fear, becoming fear. But it came at a price. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound in the dark could be the start of the end. A knock at the door might mean payment, or death, and if guilt didn't destroy you, paranoia probably would. There are even records of some assassins who tried to find redemption later in life. They would go to monasteries, confess their sins, and live as hermits or monks, hoping to cleanse their souls before death. Imagine the irony. The same hands that once gripped daggers, now building chapels or tending gardens in silence. Maybe some found peace, but most were haunted until the very end, seeing faces in their dreams, hearing the echoes of the dying. In the quiet of a monastery cell, even God's forgiveness might have felt uncertain. But still, the world kept turning. New wars began, new kings rose, new conspiracies brewed, and with them, the need for killers never really disappeared. Cities were the assassin's true hunting ground. Narrow alleys, thick crowds, endless noise, the perfect place to disappear. A countryside job might get you caught in minutes, but in a city like London, Paris, or Florence, you could blend in among the beggars, merchants, and drunks without raising an eyebrow. The smell of rot and smoke covered everything. No one looked twice at a hooded figure, and at night, the streets were so dark you could barely see your own hands. That's when the assassins went to work. Shadows inside shadows. But being unseen took effort. The best assassins weren't just killers. They were masters of disguise. They had to move through the world without leaving a trace. That meant knowing how to dress like a merchant one day, a priest the next, or a simple peasant when needed. A good assassin could vanish into the crowd like smoke, and most of the time, that was their only protection. The art of disguise became almost spiritual, not about vanity, but survival. Some learned to mimic accents, gestures, even limp slightly, if it made them seem more forgettable. The goal wasn't to stand out, it was to be invisible. Weapons were just as personal. Daggers were favored, of course, small, silent, and easy to hide. Crossbows worked for distance kills, though they were risky to carry. Poison was popular among those who preferred subtlety. The medieval world had no shortage of deadly substances. Belladonna, arsenic, hemlock, monkshood, even powdered glass. Apothecaries sold these to cure ailments, but everyone knew what they could really do. It wasn't uncommon for assassins to pretend to be healers or traders, traveling from town to town selling medicine that could also kill. Some even developed their own recipes, learning through grisly trial and error which mixtures worked best. Poison had one big advantage. It didn't require confrontation. You didn't have to swing a blade or leave a trail of blood, but it came with its own dangers. One wrong dose and your target might survive, alerting everyone. Too much, and the symptoms would look suspicious. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience and precision, two things many assassins didn't have. There were also stories of killers poisoning themselves by accident, either through inhalation or eating food they'd handled without care. You could say the job had built-in karma. And then there were the codes. Assassins had their own way of communicating. Letters written in invisible ink, often lemon juice, which only revealed words when heated by candlelight. Secret phrases hidden in prayers. Some even used simple carvings on walls or marks left in specific taverns to signal that a job had been done or payment collected. Because there were no contracts, no legal paper trails, only trust or fear. Payment was usually given in coins, relics, or favors, sometimes even food or protection, rarely gold. You didn't flash wealth when your life depended on being forgettable. In many ways, being an assassin in the medieval world was less about violence and more about patience, waiting in shadows for hours, watching a target's routine for days, memorizing guard patterns, listening for rumors, waiting for the perfect moment when someone's guard dropped. That's when you struck fast, silent, without hesitation, and then you were gone. But it wasn't always clean. Medieval armor, for example, made killing tricky. You couldn't just stab a knight in the chest and expect him to fall. You had to know the weak spots, the joints, the throat, under the armpit, or behind the knee. These details could mean life or death. Some assassins learned anatomy not from books, but from grim practice on battlefields. They studied how soldiers fell, how wounds bled, how long it took to die. It was gruesome work, but in their minds, necessary. There was also an unspoken rule: no witnesses. If someone saw you, You either silenced them or ran fast enough to disappear forever. Some refused to kill innocents, others didn't care. Morality blurred when your job was survival. A few assassins tried to justify their work by saying they only killed the wicked, corrupt nobles, tyrants, or criminals. It made the guilt easier to carry. But deep down, most knew they were just tools. And tools don't choose their purpose. City guards, though often lazy or drunk, could still pose a threat. A patrol turning a corner at the wrong time could ruin everything. The penalty for murder, especially if someone powerful, was always brutal. Hanging, burning, dismemberment, and if the victim was noble, you might be tortured first for good measure. Public punishment wasn't just justice. It was theater. The crowd would jeer, throw rotten vegetables, maybe even cheer as your body was displayed. The message was simple: fear the law more than you fear your enemy. And yet, assassins kept coming. Every generation had them. In England, during the War of the Roses, nobles hired silent blades to get rid of rivals before battles even began. In Italy, poisoners like the Borgia family turned murder into fine art. In France, courtiers whispered about nighttime killings behind palace doors. The church condemned it all publicly, but quietly used spies and agents for their own holy wars. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. Some assassins even worked for the church directly, under the banner of divine justice. These were men who convinced themselves that their daggers served God, not gold. They targeted heretics, traitors, or anyone the clergy declared dangerous. It gave them purpose, a reason to believe they weren't just sinners, but instruments of righteousness. Maybe it helped them sleep at night. Or maybe they were just better at lying to themselves than most. But for the average assassin, there was no glory, no secret brotherhood offering wisdom and unity. Just dirt, fear and hunger. Nights spent sleeping in barns or under bridges. Food scavenged from markets or stolen from distracted vendors. Clothes rarely washed. The myth of the sleek, hooded killer was centuries away. In reality, most looked like beggars. Some even pretended to be beggars during the day. Nobody suspects the poor. Sometimes, though, the line between assassin and spy blurred. Rulers needed people who could gather information just as much as they needed killers. A good spy might never have to draw a weapon, only listen, observe, and deliver secrets. But the risk was the same. One wrong word, and you were dead. The difference was, spies might get a decent bed and a plate of food once in a while. Assassins rarely got either. And then there were the women. History barely talks about them, but they existed. Courtesans, servants, healers, women who used society's blindness to their advantage. A woman could get close to powerful men without suspicion. A cup of wine, a whispered secret, a touch, and death followed quietly. These women were both feared and forgotten. Some were pawns, others, masters of their own fate. The tragedy is that most of their names were erased. Their stories never written down. But behind every noble's mysterious death, you can bet someone like them had a hand in it. For all its chaos, the assassin's world was one of strange rules and routines. You learned to move with purpose, to breathe quietly, to always have an escape route. You learned to distrust kindness, because it was often bait. You learned that loyalty was a myth, and you learned to keep your past hidden, even from yourself, because thinking too much about what you'd done could break you, faster than any sword. Some killers began to lose touch with reality after years of living this way. Paranoia turned into hallucinations. Every whisper felt like a trap. Every stranger seemed like a spy. The stress ate away at their minds, leaving them jumpy, silent, hollow-eyed. There's a reason why people back then spoke of haunted men, killers who walked like ghosts. Not from superstition, but because they'd seen too much and slept too little. And even if you managed to survive the dangers of your profession, the guilt had a way of catching up. No matter how tough you were, there were moments of stillness, late nights, when the city was quiet, and you could hear your own heartbeat. That's when memories returned. Faces of the dead, screams half forgotten, prayers whispered too late. Maybe that's why some assassins found religion near the end. Not because they believed they could undo their sins, but because silence felt worse than punishment. Some of them even wrote confessions before dying, scratched on wood, carved into walls, hidden under floorboards. They knew their names would be erased, but maybe their words would survive. A few of those fragments still exist in old records. One wrote, "I have seen the light fade from the eyes of 10 men, and each one took a piece of me." Another said, I killed for bread and lived like a ghost. Forgive me, Lord, if you still listen. It's strange, the deeper you go into history, the more human these shadows become. They weren't monsters, just people caught in a system that demanded cruelty to survive. They lived in a world that didn't offer many choices, where death was everywhere, on battlefields, in alleys, in disease, in hunger. Killing just became another trade. A terrible one, yes, but still a trade. And like every trade, it had its workers, its tools, and its victims. And yet, even as their names faded, their legend endured. The myth of the hooded assassin, striking unseen, living by a code, vanishing like smoke, that story never died. Maybe because it speaks to something deep inside us, the fascination with control, power, and the darkness we pretend we don't have. The Middle Ages were full of contradictions like that. Faith and fear, violence and beauty, sign and redemption. For the assassin, though, there was only one truth. You either lived long enough to be forgotten, or died quickly enough to be remembered. Power always attracts shadows. The higher a man climbed in the medieval world, the more enemies he made, and the more likely someone, somewhere, would whisper his name into an assassin's ear. Kings, dukes, bishops, even abbots, all of them played dangerous games, and when politics failed, blades took over. Behind every treaty, every rebellion, every throne that suddenly became vacant, there was often a hand no one saw. Assassins weren't just hired to kill. Sometimes they were used to send messages. A noble might have his rival's favorite horse poisoned, or his advisor disappear mysteriously. Not because it changed the war, but because it reminded everyone who held the real power. Fear was the best weapon a ruler could have, and nothing spread fear faster than a quiet death in the night. In a time without newspapers or phones, rumors were the internet of the Middle Ages, and a dead noble with no explanation could create panic across an entire kingdom. Some rulers became obsessed with assassins, using them as tools to keep their courts in line. Others lived in terror of them. There are chronicles that describe paranoid kings refusing to eat food that hadn't been tasted first, refusing to sleep in the same room twice, or hiring tester servants whose job was literally to die first if something was poisoned. A life of luxury came with constant dread. You had gold, but you couldn't trust anyone. A servant's smile might hide betrayal. A lover's kiss could mean death. The worst part, many assassins didn't even know the real reason behind their missions. They were told who to kill, not why. The man paying them might be working for a noble who served another noble, who in turn took orders from a distant king. Layers upon layers of lies. A web so tangled that by the time the blade struck, the killer and the target might have shared the same enemies without even realizing it. This was especially true during times of civil war. The War of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, the endless Italian feuds, all created perfect breeding grounds for assassins. When everyone's loyalty was in question, no one was safe. Letters went missing, heirs vanished, generals fell mysteriously ill. It was chaos disguised as order, and killers thrived in it. You could even find them among soldiers, mercenaries, who sold their swords to the highest bidder, then accidentally stabbed the wrong commander in the confusion of battle. And yet, there was something strangely professional about it all. The best assassins were not reckless. They followed a kind of silent discipline. They studied their targets, chose their moments, and vanished before the world noticed. The amateurs were the ones who got caught and made the rest of them look like monsters. For every brutal murder in an alley, there were a dozen that went unnoticed, written off as accidents or divine punishment. Poison was still the favorite tool of the elite. You couldn't stab a king in his own castle, but you could slip something deadly into his wine. Poisonings were the silent symphonies of the medieval world, slow, deliberate, elegant in a horrifying way. Chroniclers often wrote about nobles falling ill after banquets. Everyone knew what that meant, but nobody dared say the word aloud. The rich didn't like to talk about murder. They preferred to call it fate. And if you think assassins were invisible to history, you're half right. Their names are mostly gone, but their work shaped empires. One dead prince could shift the line of succession. One dead general could turn a victory into defeat. The fall of a kingdom might begin with a single blade in a back alley. Wars were won and lost in silence. That's the kind of power these unseen people held, even if they never realized it. But the power came with a curse. The closer you got to the powerful, the more dangerous the world became. A successful assassin might get rewarded, gold, land, even protection, but it was always temporary. Sooner or later, someone higher up would decide you'd seen too much. There are records of assassins being executed by the same nobles who once hired them, sometimes publicly, sometimes quietly, in the same way they used to kill others. It's the oldest story in the world, the tool that becomes too sharp and must be broken. Some tried to escape. They ran to distant lands, changed their names, started new lives, maybe as farmers, guards, or monks. But you can't outrun your own shadow. Rumors traveled faster than people. Someone always recognized your face, or remembered the scar on your hand, or the way you walked. In small medieval towns, anonymity was impossible. And if your past didn't find you, your guilt did. The church had a special way of dealing with killers who sought forgiveness. You could confess, of course, but absolution wasn't free. Pilgrimages were common punishments, walking hundreds of miles barefoot, fasting, praying, carrying relics to holy sites. Some were even sent to fight in the Crusades as penance. The irony was painful. After a life of killing for money, you were now killing for God. Different paymaster, same job, and even among those who survived, the body paid the price. Constant stress, poor diet, untreated injuries. Assassins aged fast. A man in his 30s might look 50. Infection from a small wound could turn deadly within days. There were no doctors for people like them. You couldn't walk into a healer's hut and say, "I got stabbed while killing a duke." You stitched yourself up, drank something strong, and hoped to wake up in the morning. Many didn't dot in some cases. Entire families were wiped out because one member had been an assassin. Guilt by association was normal. If you were caught, your wife might be flogged, your children exiled, your home burned. The message was simple. Crime doesn't die with the criminal. Fear became a weapon of control. It wasn't just about punishing one man. It was about reminding everyone else to stay in line. Over time, though, the image of the assassin began to change. By the late Middle Ages, storytellers started romanticizing them, turning these miserable killers into mysterious heroes. Minstrels sang about hooded figures who brought justice to the corrupt. Writers began to imagine secret orders guided by sacred codes, killing not for gold, but for ideals. It was pure fantasy, but people loved it. In a world full of chaos, the idea of an assassin with honor felt comforting. Reality, of course, was less noble. Real assassins didn't have grand philosophies or secret symbols. They didn't leap from towers or swear oaths to brotherhoods. They were just trying to survive another night. But the legends persisted, maybe because they said something true about the time, that even in darkness, people longed for purpose, that they wanted to believe there could be honor in violence, meaning in cruelty, redemption in sin. You can still trace how these old stories evolved. By the Renaissance, paintings and poems began to depict shadow agents and nightblades as tragic figures, doomed souls caught between duty and damnation. The myth of the assassin had become art. Nobles even started dressing like them at masquerade balls, wearing dark cloaks and masks, pretending for one night to be the thing they feared most. The irony was delicious, but for the real killers, still working the streets, nothing changed. Poverty still ruled their lives. The same hunger, the same filth, the same fear. No matter how romantic the stories became, the reality stayed ugly. A knife was still a knife, and a job was still a job. Maybe that's why history rarely remembers their names, because their stories don't end well. And yet, they were part of the fabric of that world. They shaped politics, toppled kings, changed the course of wars, all from the shadows. The medieval assassin was both invisible and essential, a symptom of a violent society that needed people willing to do what others wouldn't. You can almost pity them, born into a world that demanded cruelty, trapped in a cycle they never chose. Every time a chronicler wrote, "The Lord died suddenly," there might have been a blade behind it. Every time a queen wept in public, there might have been poison in her tears. The medieval world ran on blood, sometimes spilled openly in battle, sometimes quietly behind closed doors. The assassin was just another gear in that bloody machine. But if there's one truth that echoes through all of it, it's this: the life of a medieval assassin wasn't thrilling, or glamorous, or noble. It was lonely, short, and miserable. You lived unseen, and you died unremembered. You were a ghost before you ever hit the grave. And still, even ghosts leave traces. When you lived by the blade in the Middle Ages, you didn't have a pension plan. You didn't have savings, or even the faintest hope of retiring on a farm by the sea. If you managed to survive long enough to grow old, you'd likely find your reflexes dulled, your back bent, and your hands shaking from too many cold nights sleeping on wet ground. That's when the real terror began, not of dying, but of becoming useless. An old assassin wasn't a respected veteran. He was a loose end. Employers didn't keep loose ends alive. The few who made it that far usually vanished quietly, their bodies dumped in some nameless ditch, or they ended up living under false names in remote villages, pretending to be humble fishermen or monks. But the past always had a way of finding them. Some former killers confessed everything to priests, hoping for forgiveness. Others drank themselves into oblivion, haunted by the faces of people they'd never meant to kill. And let's not forget the constant curse of superstition. Every odd shadow, every squeak of the wind through the rafters could send your heart racing. In a world where everyone believed in demons, witches, and cursed souls, assassins were thought to carry dark energy. People whispered that their hands were permanently stained by evil, that no holy water could cleanse them. In taverns, they'd drink alone, because even the drunkest peasant didn't want to sit too close to someone who might have killed a bishop or a noble's cousin. And if an assassin got sick, well, no healer would treat him. They'd say, "God's punishment, let the devil heal his own." So, you'd lie there on a straw mat, coughing and sweating, watching your blade rust beside you. That was your nurse, your comfort, your only friend. Sometimes, you'd try to find redemption, maybe join a crusade, where killing was suddenly holy again. Many assassins signed up for the wars in the Holy Land not because they believed in the cause, but because it gave them a way to kill without guilt. The church called them soldiers of God, and they called it a clean slate. But it wasn't. Under the burning sun of Jerusalem, they saw the same blood, the same cries, the same nightmares replaying behind their eyes. When the war ended, they came home with crosses on their cloaks, but ghosts still followed them to bed. You could wash the body in holy water, but you couldn't wash the mind. And imagine, for a moment, being caught. That was every assassin's nightmare, because if you were discovered, the punishment wasn't quick. The medieval justice system believed in making an example out of traitors and murderers. Public execution wasn't just punishment, it was theater. You'd be dragged through the streets, covered in filth, jeered at by the same people who'd once paid you for protection. Sometimes, they'd nail your crimes on a board and hang it around your neck as you walked to the gallows. If you'd killed a noble, you'd be tortured first. The rack, the wheel, iron claws, every instrument of pain the human mind could invent. Confession wasn't about truth, it was about spectacle. And when they finally killed you, it wasn't to end your suffering, it was to entertain the crowd. Your name would be erased, your family shamed, and your body left to rot as a warning. But even if you escaped death, you were never truly free. The medieval world was small, word traveled fast, and memories were long. A stable boy might recognize your face years later. A tavern girl might whisper your name. Maybe an old comrade, desperate for coin, might sell you out. Paranoia became your constant companion. Every knock on the door, every stranger's glance, it all felt like the moment before the knife went in. And in a cruel twist of irony, many assassins ended up being killed by assassins. Not out of revenge, but as part of the endless cycle of hired death that defined the Middle Ages. And what about love? Forget it. No one wanted to share a bed with someone whose profession involved sneaking out at midnight and coming home with blood on their boots. Relationships were risky. They made you vulnerable. You couldn't afford to have someone know where you slept or what jobs you took. So, most assassins lived lonely lives, their hearts guarded as tightly as their daggers. Some found fleeting comfort in brothels, but even the women there could sense the darkness. They'd say things like, "Your eyes look like you've already died once," and maybe, in a way, they had. Food was another daily struggle. When you're hiding from the law or the church, you can't just stroll into a market and buy a roasted chicken. You'd scavenge, steal, or hunt. If you were lucky, you'd catch a rabbit. If not, stale bread and dirty water were your feast. Nights were colder when your stomach growled, and the moon looked down like a silent witness. Every meal was a reminder of how far you'd fallen from the idea of glory or wealth. And yet, there was always one more job, one more promise of silver, one more lie to keep you alive a little longer. And in all this, the strangest thing was how invisible they became. Assassins lived in the shadows for so long that they started to fade into them. People would forget their real names. Even they would forget who they once were. They'd become stories told by frightened mothers to their children, ghosts that snuck through windows and vanished into fog. And when they finally died, no one mourned them. No gravestone, No prayer, no candlelight vigil, just silence. The kind of silence that made you wonder if they'd ever existed at all. Some said that on moonless nights, when the streets were empty and the air heavy, you could hear their footsteps, still the sound of guilt echoing through time. But maybe that's just what happens when history forgets the people it used. The assassins of the Middle Ages weren't heroes or monsters. They were just tools, disposable, necessary, and ultimately forgotten. There were nights when the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The moon would vanish behind the clouds, and the only sound was the wind pushing through the narrow alleys. For an assassin, that silence was both friend and enemy. It made it easier to move unseen, but it also made every step echo louder, every mistake sharper. The city could be a labyrinth of shadows, cobblestone streets that twisted like veins, doors that led nowhere, whispers of dogs growling behind fences. You learned to read the night like a map. The faint flicker of a candle in a window meant someone was still awake. A shutter left open was an invitation or a trap. Every mission was a dance with uncertainty, and the wrong step could end it all. Before a job, you'd sit in some dark corner, sharpening your blade on a whetstone, the slow rasping sound almost soothing. You'd think about the target, someone rich, powerful, untouchable. You'd think about how their life would end in silence, how their breath would stop with one small motion. You told yourself it was just work. You didn't care who they were or why they had to die. But deep down, something always twisted inside. Not guilt, exactly. More like a dull awareness that you were just a shadow passing through someone else's story. You never existed until the moment you took their life, and once you did, you vanished again. Sometimes the job didn't go cleanly. Maybe the target fought back. Maybe a servant woke too early, or a guard spotted movement. A single shout in the night could destroy everything. You'd run barefoot through alleys, jumping fences, breathing hard, feeling the blood pounding in your ears. There was no dignity in escape, only the animal instinct to live. And if you made it back to your hideout, you'd collapse on the floor, covered in sweat, shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. You'd sit there in the dark, staring at your hands, trying to remember when they started trembling. You'd whisper a prayer, not to God, but to whoever might listen. Just one more night, and even when you succeeded, there was no celebration. You couldn't tell anyone. You couldn't brag or drink to your victory. You'd just hand the proof to your employer, ring, a letter, sometimes a severed earrand. They'd give you your payment without even meeting your eyes. A few coins, maybe a loaf of bread, maybe a promise of more work soon. Then you'd leave, slipping back into the mist, your pockets heavier but your soul lighter, only for a heartbeat. By morning, someone else would be dead, and your name would already be fading from the story. There were times when assassins tried to organize themselves, to form brotherhoods or guilds. They imagined they could turn murder into a trade, with rules and honor codes. But the Middle Ages didn't allow such fantasies for long. Rival lords used them, betrayed them, and wiped them out the moment they became inconvenient. The church called them heretics, the nobles called them cowards, and the peasants called them cursed. You couldn't build a family out of fear. You couldn't build loyalty out of blood. Still, every now and then, one assassin would rise above the rest, someone whose name became legend, whose skills were whispered about across kingdoms. The kind who could slip through locked doors, poison a goblet without being seen, or disappear into a crowd before the body even hit the ground. But fame was poison. The more people knew your name, the shorter your life became. Eventually, even the best met their end, usually betrayed by a friend, a lover, or their own reflection in a polished blade. The Middle Ages had no place for living legends, only dead ones. And if you ever got tired of killing, you couldn't simply walk away. Once you'd taken coin for blood, that mark never left you. If you tried to live as a farmer or a craftsman, someone would eventually recognize you. Maybe the scar on your hand, the way you moved, the way you flinched at sudden noises. You could change your name, but not your past. So, you'd keep wandering, town to town, face to face, always searching for a place that didn't exist. The world was too small for people who lived in shadows. On rare nights, you'd find yourself standing on a hill outside a sleeping village. The stars above would look close enough to touch, and for a brief moment, you'd imagine what it would feel like to live a normal life, to wake with the sun, to hear laughter instead of screams, to grow old in peace. But the dawn always came too soon, and with it, reality. You'd pull your hood up, tighten your belt, and start walking again. The road was your only constant companion, the horizon your only home. And perhaps the cruelest part was this: for all their skill, for all their fear and sacrifice, medieval assassins changed almost nothing. Kings still waged wars, nobles still schemed, the church still burned heretics. The wheel of history turned, grinding them into dust, like everyone else. They were tools in the hands of others, and when the job was done, they were forgotten. No statues, no songs, no legacy, just names scratched out of old letters and bloodstains on forgotten floors. The irony was that in killing others, they became invisible. Their lives were erased to protect the very people who used them. The perfect assassin wasn't the one who killed the fastest or escaped the cleanest. It was the one who left no trace at all, not even a whisper of his name. And maybe that was the true curse of their trade, to live in the dark so completely that even history refused to remember them. But history has a strange way of keeping secrets. Every once in a while, a story surfaces, a chronicle written by a monk, a rumor recorded by a traveler, a half-burned confession found in a monastery. These fragments are all we have left. They paint a picture, not of noble killers or grand conspiracies, but of lonely, desperate souls caught between survival and damnation. And if you listen closely, if you let your mind drift to those empty medieval streets, you might still hear the faintest whisper of them, the sound of a dagger being drawn, the quiet sigh of a life ending in the dark, the echo of footsteps that history forgot. In the world of medieval cities, you could almost smell danger in the air. The narrow streets twisted like secrets, and every corner had a story. If you looked close enough, you could see it in the flicker of torchlight, the glint of eyes that watched from shadows, the brief reflection of a blade being wiped clean. The assassin walked among ordinary people, invisible, just another cloak in the night, but he carried the weight of death like an invisible crown, and he knew, deep inside, that the same city that hired him today would hang him tomorrow, if it suited them. Most assassins didn't start out wanting to kill for money. They began as something else: soldiers, mercenaries, thieves, or even desperate farmers. Maybe they lost their land in a war, or watched their family starve during a bad harvest. The world didn't give them choices. It gave them hunger and cold. Killing became a trade like any other, a craft of survival. And once you learned the craft, it was hard to unlearn. You could go back to the fields, but the soil never looked the same after you'd seen blood soak into it. The medieval world didn't romanticize killers. There was no secret brotherhood, no noble creed, no hooded elegance. Most worked alone, under false names, and moved from place to place, like ghosts. Some were hired by nobles who wanted rivals gone, others by merchants who wanted competition out of the way. Even the church sometimes whispered in dark corners, paying silver to silence a heretic before his words spread too far. And yet, the same priests would stand at the pulpit and preach about sin, damnation, and eternal fire. Hypocrisy was another coin that never stopped turning. Weapons were crude but effective. Daggers were small and easy to hide. Short swords were common among the more reckless ones. But the most feared weapon of all was poison. It could slip silently into wine or stew, or be hidden under the fingernails. Some assassins learned the art of mixing deadly herbs, belladonna, hemlock, arsenic, taught by old apothecaries who cared more for coin than conscience. A drop too much could kill you too, so you had to test it carefully, sometimes on animals, sometimes not. One mistake, one wrong mixture, and you'd find yourself foaming at the mouth before you could even finish your meal. And yet, even with all their caution, life was fragile. There was always someone watching, a servant who saw you where you shouldn't be, a guard who remembered your face. The line between hunter and hunted was paper thin. Some assassins tried to protect themselves with superstition, carrying charms, relics, or little bones wrapped in leather to ward off bad luck. They'd whisper prayers before a kill, not for mercy, but for invisibility. Let their eyes be blind, let their ears be deaf. But prayers didn't stop knives, and luck never lasted forever. It's strange to think how quiet their deaths often were. No grand duels, no dramatic final words. Just a slip in the dark, a blade between the ribs, a gasp, and then stillness. The assassin who lived by shadows also died in them. And by the next morning, the city moved on. Bakers opened their shops, priests rang the bells, and children chased chickens through muddy streets. The world didn't care that one more ghost had joined the endless night. Sometimes a few of them tried to find meaning in what they did. They told themselves they were balancing the scales, removing tyrants, punishing traitors, serving justice where the law was blind. But deep down, they knew it was a lie. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't a scale, it was a sword. It served whoever held the hilt, and assassins, they were just the edge. If you walked through a medieval tavern at night, you might have seen them sitting alone, cloaks pulled low, faces turned away from the firelight. They listened more than they spoke. Every conversation was a potential lead, every stranger a possible employer or threat. The smell of cheap ale, wet wool, and smoke filled the air. Somewhere, a lute played a sad tune about lost love, and for a brief moment, you could almost forget the world outside. But they never truly relaxed. A hand always rested near the dagger. Sleep never came easy. Even dreams had shadows. There was a strange poetry in their loneliness. They were both feared and needed. People wanted their services, but not their company. Even the whores avoided them, saying they brought death wherever they went. Some of them didn't mind. They said it was better to walk alone, less to lose, less to regret. But isolation eats at the soul. It makes you see ghosts where there are none, hear footsteps that aren't there. After a while, silence becomes too loud. Some assassins started talking to their blades, naming them like companions. "You're the only one who understands me," they'd whisper, before wiping the blood clean once again. Aging was another kind of death. The body that once moved silently began to betray its own weight. Knees cracked, reflexes slowed, eyes strained to see through the dark. The young assassins didn't respect the old ones. They thought them weak, outdated, too careful. And maybe they were right. The new generation was reckless, faster, hungrier. They didn't care about stealth. They cared about silver. They killed noisily, brutally, and vanished just as quickly. The older assassins watched them with pity, knowing how short that kind of life was. The streets had always devoured the bold first. But even in their final years, some killers clung to the hope of redemption. They sought out monasteries, shaved their heads, and tried to hide behind prayers. The monks never asked too many questions. Everyone in those days had sins to bury. So, the assassin would spend his last years tending gardens, copying scriptures, or repairing roofs. Simple things, quiet things. But at night, when the candles burned low, he'd sometimes feel his hands shaking, remembering the weight of a dagger, the warmth of blood, the rush of silence after a kill. And he'd wonder if God could really forgive him for all the names he'd erased. In a way, those who found peace in religion were the lucky ones. Most never made it that far. They died in alleys, on the run, betrayed, poisoned, or simply forgotten. No one buried them, no one prayed. Their bones became part of the dirt roads that travelers walked upon centuries later. And history, it forgot their faces, their voices, their lives. All that remained were stories told in whispers, the kind that make you glance over your shoulder when the night grows too quiet. If you stood in one of those medieval towns today, in the ruins of old streets and crumbling castles, you could still feel it, the weight of what once happened there. The walls remember, the stones that once echoed with footsteps, the doorways where shadows lingered, the wells where secrets were buried. They all hold fragments of the past, waiting for someone to listen. And if you listen long enough, you might hear the faint sigh of history itself, tired, quiet, and still carrying the ghost of a life that never truly belonged anywhere, because that was the people assassin's curse. To be everyone's tool but no one's story, to shape history without ever being written into it, to live in silence, to die in silence, and to be remembered only as a whisper carried by the wind. There's a strange kind of beauty in danger, the way it sharpens everything around you. For the medieval assassin, that sharpness was constant. Every breath, every flicker of a torch, every sound in the dark meant something. He lived half awake, senses stretched thin, your mind calculating every possible exit. It wasn't bravery that kept you alive, but instinct, a raw animal awareness that never left, even when you wanted to sleep. The Middle Ages weren't a kind world. They didn't reward skill, they rewarded luck. And assassins, well, they needed both just to make it through another night. When an assassin was hired, it usually started with a whisper. No written contracts, no formal agreements. Words passed quietly in the corner of a tavern, or through a servant's trembling hands. A name, a description, a location, payment in advance, half if you were lucky. The moment you accepted, you became invisible. You couldn't tell anyone, couldn't rest, couldn't even think about failure. Because in that world, a failed assassin didn't get a second chance, not from his employer, not from the law, not even from himself. Failure meant exposure, and exposure meant death. The approach was everything. You studied your target's habits like a scholar studying scripture. When they ate, where they slept, who guarded them, which door they used on stormy nights. You watched them from shadows, memorizing the rhythm of their life until it became almost intimate. You knew their laughter, their anger, their sighs. You knew them better than their own family. And in that closeness, something unsettling grew. To kill someone, you had to understand them. You had to step into their world, if only for a moment. And when the moment came, when the blade slipped across the throat, or the poison took hold, it wasn't just their life ending. It was the breaking of a connection that shouldn't have existed in the first place. That strange bond made every job a quiet form of heartbreak. Afterward, you didn't look back. You couldn't afford to. The city swallowed bodies quickly. The rats, the disease, the dirt. By sunrise, someone else's blood was already being washed off the stones. Someone else's sin buried under gossip. You moved on, carrying your silence like armor. But silence is heavy, and it grows heavier the longer you wear it. Every kill etched itself somewhere inside you, not in the memory but in the body. A stiffness in the hands, a twitch when someone raised their voice, a blank stare when laughter echoed too loudly. The scars of an assassin were invisible, but they ran deep. The strange thing is, some people admired them. In the darker corners of medieval society, assassins were legends. The poor whispered about them like heroes, the ones who could take down tyrants and lords. He killed a baron with a kitchen knife. Someone would say, she poisoned a bishop during mass. Another would swear. They became myths, half human, half shadow. But the truth was far less glamorous. Most of them weren't fighting for justice or revenge. They were fighting for bread, for warmth, for another day to live. And the same people who idolized them would be the first to throw stones if they were ever caught. When the work dried up, the desperation grew. Some assassins turned to banditry, ambushing travelers on lonely roads. Others sold their skills to the highest bidder, no matter how filthy the job. There were no moral lines left, just hunger and fear. The Middle Ages were full of wars, plots, and secret feuds, and wherever there was power, there was someone willing to pay for blood. The assassin's world was a constant chessboard, and they were pawns pretending to be kings. If they ever felt guilt, they rarely showed it. In that time, guilt was a luxury for the innocent. The church preached that killers would burn in hell, but to a man who'd already seen hell on earth, that threat meant little. Still, some tried to atone in small ways. They'd leave coins for the families of their victims, or pray quietly in empty chapels. A few even carved marks into trees or walls, one for every life they'd taken, not as trophies, but as reminders. You could count the dead, but you could never unkill them. And then there was the loneliness that came with the job. You couldn't keep friends. They were liabilities. You couldn't stay in one town. The past always had longer legs. You slept where no one could find you, in stables, under bridges, in ruined towers. You learned to make fire without smoke, to eat without sound, to walk without leaving prints. The night became your only friend, the stars your only witnesses. But even they began to look cold after a while, as if they too were judging you from above. Winter was the worst. The cold seeped through the cracks in your boots. The snow muffled every sound, and your hands went numb around the dagger. There were no warm fires for people like you. You couldn't risk being seen at an inn, couldn't ask for shelter. Sometimes you'd break into empty barns just to sleep beside the animals for warmth. And when morning came, you'd move before the farmers woke, leaving behind nothing but footprints fading in the frost. To survive the medieval winter was to fight nature itself, hunger, cold, and loneliness, all at once. But despite everything, some of them found a strange peace in the rhythm of it all. The simplicity of the kill, the focus, the quiet after. There was no politics in that moment, no fear, no hunger, just stillness. Some said that was the only time they ever truly felt alive, the heartbeat between the blades' rise and fall. It was an addiction that no priest could cure, no prayer could soothe. Even those who tried to stop often found themselves drawn back in. Killing wasn't just a job anymore. It was a way of breathing. And when they died, which most did young, there was rarely a body to bury. Sometimes a guard would find one in a ditch, throat cut by someone faster. Sometimes a town would hang a nameless corpse in the square, calling it justice. But more often, they just disappeared, swallowed by the same shadows they'd once mastered. The only trace left was rumor, and rumor fades faster than blood. In the end, That was what truly sucked about being a medieval assassin. Not the danger, not even the fear, but the emptiness. You lived without roots, without love, without peace. You were needed but never wanted, feared but never respected, known but never remembered. You were a ghost in your own lifetime, haunting the living world long before death came for you. And when it finally did, it didn't even whisper your name. So if you ever find yourself romanticizing the idea of a hooded killer moving through the mist, remember this: behind every silent blade was a trembling hand. Behind every clean kill was a dirty soul. And behind every shadow was someone who just wanted to be seen, even for a moment, before the darkness swallowed them whole. You're crouched in the dark corner of a medieval alleyway, the smell of stale beer and damp straw in your nose. The cobblestones are slick with something that might be rain, or it might be sewage. Either way, it's not great. The flickering light of a torch passes by the corner, and your heart stops for a moment. It's the town watch. If they catch you here, with that dagger tucked under your cloak, you'll be lucky if they hang you before they start pulling out your fingernails. You take a slow breath, staying perfectly still. The guard yawns, mutters something about his aching feet, and keeps walking. When his footsteps fade away, you let the air out slowly. The job isn't done yet. Somewhere up there, behind those shuttered windows, your target is probably snoring into a pillow stuffed with goose feathers, and you're about to risk your life for a handful of coins and the faint hope of not starving this winter. See, that's the cruel joke of being a medieval assassin. The people who hired you thought you were a ghost, deadly, silent, mysterious, but the truth was, you were just another poor soul doing the dirtiest work in Europe. You weren't trained by shadowy masters in some ancient order. You learned your craft the hard way, through bad luck, dumb mistakes, and running from the authorities more often than not. You probably didn't even call yourself an assassin. That word came from stories about faraway killers in the mountains of Syria, the Hashishin. In Europe, you might have been known as a cutthroat, a knife man, or a bravo if you worked for an Italian noble. Each job meant disguises, lies, and the constant danger that your client would turn you in to save his own neck. But even if you survived the act itself, the escape was often the hardest part. Towns in the Middle Ages weren't exactly friendly to strangers, especially at night. If you were found wandering alone with blood on your boots, you might as well confess. There weren't any fancy police investigations, just a crowd, a few witnesses, and a rope. And if you somehow did get away, you couldn't exactly retire rich. The money was barely enough to eat for a month or two. Maybe you'd drink it all away at a tavern, hoping to forget the face of the man you killed. Maybe you'd head to another city, start over, change your name. But word spread fast, and Europe was smaller than you'd think. Many of these so-called assassins were ex-soldiers. When wars ended, thousands of men trained in violence were suddenly unemployed. Some became bandits, some mercenaries, and a few, the unlucky or ambitious ones, found work in the shadows. Nobles used them to settle private feuds, remove rivals, or even silence witnesses. It wasn't about honor. It was business. And because these jobs were secret, there was no loyalty. If your employer decided you knew too much, he'd hire another man to get rid of you. Paranoia wasn't just part of the job, it was survival. Imagine sleeping in barns, always with one eye open, dagger in hand. You'd dream of the people you killed. Sometimes their faces changed, sometimes you couldn't remember them at all. And in the morning, you'd wake up shivering, because even the rats didn't want to share your hay pile. The church didn't make things easier either. Officially, murder was a mortal sin, but in practice, plenty of bishops and priests quietly looked the other way when politics were involved. A noble might pay for a mass to cleanse his soul right after ordering an assassination. The killer, though, had no such luxury. He lived outside the grace of God, outside the law, outside everything that made medieval life bearable. And then there were the tools of the trade. Forget sleek daggers and hidden blades. Those came centuries later. A medieval assassin's weapon was whatever could get the job done. A rusty knife, a short sword, a hammer, even a poisoned cup of wine. Poison was popular because it was cleaner, but risky. It took knowledge, timing, and luck. Too much, and the victim might notice before drinking. Too little, and they'd just get sick instead of dead. Of course, there were other ways. A push down the stairs, a hunting accident, a fire in the middle of the night. These were the tricks of men who wanted to disappear afterward, who wanted their kills to look like fate instead of murder. But every assassin knew, the more clever the kill, the more attention it drew. The safest way was often the simplest: a dark corner, a quick thrust, and a fast exit. That's the brutal honesty of it. The medieval assassin wasn't a romantic figure or a symbol of freedom. He was a symptom of a world where violence was normal, and justice was just another service you could buy if you had enough gold. Sometimes assassins even worked for the church itself. During the Crusades, rumors spread of secret killings blessed by priests, justified as holy duty. Killing in the name of God was still killing, but people convinced themselves it was righteous. For everyone else, though, there was only one end. Sooner or later, every assassin met a blade sharper than his own. Maybe he was betrayed, maybe caught by a clever sheriff, maybe just unlucky. Some ended up in dungeons so foul they begged for the executioner's mercy. Others vanished without a trace, their bones left in shallow graves outside the city walls. And still, there were always more ready to take their place. Because when your belly's empty and winter's coming, morality doesn't matter much. Gold talks louder than guilt. So the next time you imagine those hooded figures leaping across rooftops, remember this: in real medieval Europe, there were no assassins, guilds, or secret codes. Just desperate men with blades, trying not to die before sunrise. And if you somehow survived enough jobs to grow old, which was rare, you wouldn't be remembered as a master killer. You'd die in a tavern, nameless, with only your regrets for company. Because in a world ruled by kings, priests, and paranoia, being the man who dealt in death was a curse all its own. You're sitting in a smoky tavern now, the kind where the floor is always sticky, and the ale tastes faintly of horse. The laughter around you sounds rough, dangerous: mercenaries, gamblers, thieves, and the kind of people who look like they've seen too many winters and not enough soap. It's here, in places like this, that most assassins found their next job. You don't exactly apply for it. There's no parchment ad saying wanted, discreet professional, good with knives, must not talk much. No, you just listen. Someone complains loudly about a rival, or whispers about a noble who's becoming a problem. You drop a hint, maybe flash the hilt of your dagger just enough for the right eyes to notice. Deals are made over spilled beer and muttered words, sealed with coin, not contracts. And every job comes with its own smell of dread. You can never be sure who's really behind the payment. The man hiring you might just be a messenger, maybe even one who doesn't know the whole story. You could be eliminating a noble's rival, or you could be part of a game 10 layers deep, where every player has already prepared for betrayal. You finish your drink and step outside. The cold air bites through your cloak. You pull it tighter, adjusting the knife hidden beneath. The city's streets are quiet, just the shuffle of a drunk or the distant bark of a dog. Your footsteps echo softly as you make your way toward the dark corner where your client said you'd find your target. The thing about these cities, Florence, London, Paris, is that even at midnight, someone's always awake. A baker lighting his oven, a watchman patrolling, a beggar searching the gutters. Every one of them could be the witness that ends your life. You walk with the slow confidence of someone who belongs. Even if you don single quotes T. Up ahead, you see a faint glow, a lamp in a window. Your target's house. You stop in the shadows, heart pounding. It's always like this, that little war between your brain and your hand. You tell yourself it's just another job, just another life that has to end so you can keep yours going. But in the silence, every thought feels loud. When you finally move, you move fast. A shadow slipping through a door that wasn't quite latched. The faint squeak of wood, a breath held tight, and then done. A life ended, quick and ugly. You leave through the same door, wiping the blade on your cloak, already thinking about the payment. But behind that cold calculation, something else lingers. Not guilt, exactly. Just the echo of being the only one awake in a sleeping world, the only one who knows what just happened. You head back to the tavern, expecting your employer to be gone. They always are. Instead, a cloaked figure waits by the fire. He doesn't look up as you approach, just slides a small pouch across the table. You pick it up, heavier than expected. But when you look again, he's already gone. You don't ask questions. You don't want answers. That's how assassins survived, by pretending not to care who they served, as long as the silver was real. But here's the truth, the money never lasted. 1 week of comfort, maybe 2, and it was back to the same cold hunger. The real wealth in medieval Europe was land, not coin. And assassins never owned land. They moved too often, trusted too little, and died too young. Some tried to climb higher, to become hired blades for powerful lords or dukes, but that only meant sharper dangers. Nobles didn't like witnesses, and even the most loyal killer was disposable once his task was done. Others turned their skills toward justice. Town councils sometimes hired secret killers to eliminate bandits or political enemies. Imagine that, the law paying a murderer to clean up the streets. It happened more often than you'd think, but no matter how official it sounded, the job never changed. Blood, coin, silence, the three constants of a life spent in the shadows, and the church. It never stopped whispering about damnation. Priests preached that every assassin's soul was bound for hell, but if the same assassin killed a heretic or a pagan, suddenly it was a righteous act. Hypocrisy was practically a sacrament. Then there was the fear of betrayal. You could never trust anyone, not even your friends. There were stories of assassins who killed their own partners just to claim the full payment. The older killers said that working alone was the only way to stay alive, but even that wasn't a guarantee, because sometimes the blade that found your back didn't come from an enemy. It came from the very man who once paid you. If you were lucky, you died fast. If not, you were caught. And being caught in medieval Europe was its own brand of horror. The torture wasn't just to make you confess, it was a performance. Public pain as entertainment. They'd stretch you on the rack, crush your fingers, burn you with irons, until you gave names that might not even exist. The crowd would cheer, the guards would laugh, and you'd die slower than the memories fading from your mind. Yet people still did it, still took up the blade. Why? Because when you have nothing, no home, no hope, no safety, fear loses its teeth. The promise of a few coins feels like a miracle. You stop thinking about the afterlife and start thinking about your next meal, and that's the tragedy of it all. Most assassins didn't start out wanting to kill. They were farmers whose crops failed, soldiers whose wars ended, sons cast out for stealing bread. The world pushed them into corners, and the knife was the only thing that offered a way out. You'd think that would make them monsters, but in truth, they were just reflections of the world they lived in, a world that rewarded cruelty, punished mercy, and believed that a man's worth was measured in what he could destroy. The city bells ring in the distance. Morning is coming. Another job finished. Another night survived. You pull your hood tighter and vanish into the fog. Because in this world, you don't get statues or stories. You don't get songs sung in your name. You get silence. And maybe, if you're lucky, you get to keep breathing a little longer. The fog hasn't lifted yet. The streets of the city are slick, grey, and eerily quiet. You walk with your head down, just another figure among the early risers. Bakers hauling flour, apprentices sweeping doorsteps, beggars clutching their rags. Nobody looks twice at you, but that doesn't mean you're safe. In the medieval city, everyone's watching someone. You pass a church. The bells are ringing for morning mass, the sound cutting through the mist like judgment itself. For a moment, you wonder if anyone inside could tell what you've done. The priests talk about sin, redemption, the fires of hell, but for men like you, those words don't mean much anymore. You've already accepted that God stopped listening a long time ago. Still, something in the sound makes you pause. You remember being a child, once before war, before hunger, before the first time you realized a knife could mean the difference between life and death. Back then, you thought the world was fair. Now you know it's just cruel in different shapes. The fog thins as you reach the edge of the marketplace. The stalls are being set up, fishmongers unpacking barrels that stink to heaven, merchants arguing over who gets the sunny spots, and peasants shuffling in with baskets of wilted greens. Life goes on, indifferent to the blood that was spilled only hours ago. That's the strange thing about killing. The world doesn't stop for it. The sun rises, the markets open, and everyone just keeps living, pretending they don't know. You keep walking. There's a well near the square, a place you've used before to wash away the stains that no one must see. The water's cold, biting your skin, but you scrub until your hands are red. You stare at your reflection for a moment, distorted by ripples. Who is that person? A ghost? A man? Something in between? You look away before you can decide. Later, you find yourself wandering into the poorer part of town. The buildings here lean on each other like drunks, and the streets are narrow enough for whispers to carry. This is home, if the word still means anything. A low-ceilinged room above a tanner's workshop, filled with the constant stench of leather and lime. You sleep on straw, keep your few belongings in a sack, and trust no one. But today, there's a knock on your door. 3 times, slow, deliberate. You freeze. Only 2 people know where you live, and both owe you money. You reach for your knife before opening the door just enough to see who stands outside. A boy, barely 14, eyes too sharp for his age. He holds a sealed parchment, wax stamped with the crest of a noble house you don't recognize. Message, he says, trying to sound braver than he feels. You toss him a coin, take the letter, and shut the door. The seal breaks easily. Inside, neat handwriting, short, to the point. A name, a place, a sum. You read it twice, then burn it over the small candle. You've learned to do that. Too many assassins got caught because they kept proof. The smoke curls upward, black and slow, disappearing into the cracks in the ceiling. You sigh. Another job, another ghost to add to the list. That night, you prepare. Every movement is a ritual now. Checking your blade, wrapping your boots with cloth so they don't make a sound, testing the small vial of poison you keep hidden in your belt. You move like someone half asleep, your hands doing the work while your mind drifts somewhere far away. Maybe that's the trick. You don't think about what you're going to do, you just do it. The job takes you to the edge of the city, near the river. There's a small manor there, guarded but not well. You watch from a distance, noting every torch, every patrol. You wait for hours, crouched in the mud, cold creeping into your bones. When the moment comes, it's almost too quiet. A guard walks away to relieve himself. Another nods off by the gate. You slip inside. It goes wrong almost immediately. The target's not asleep. He's awake, reading by candlelight. He looks up as you enter. For a moment, neither of you moves. You see his eyes widen, not with fear, but recognition. He says your name. Your real name. You freeze. Nobody's said that in years. Then the candle tips, wax spilling across the table, flame catching on parchment. He lunges for the sword beside him. You react faster. Pure instinct. A blur of motion. A sound like air tearing, and then silence again. The only light now is the small fire spreading across the papers. You'll stand there, heart pounding, staring at what you've done. You don't even know who he was. Not really. But he knew you. That thought burns hotter than the fire. You grab the bag of coins from the desk and run outside. The alarm bells start ringing. You sprint through the fields, past the sleeping houses, down toward the riverbank. You dive into the freezing water without thinking. It hits like stone, knocking the breath out of you. But you keep swimming, because stopping means dying. When you finally crawl out on the far side, soaked and shivering, the city's torches are just dots in the distance. You lie there for a while, coughing, your whole body aching. The coins in your pouch clink softly, mocking you. You made it out alive, barely. But now there's a name echoing in your head. Your own name. If that noble knew it, others might too. And once that happens, it's only a matter of time before the hunters come. You don't sleep that night. You sit by a dying fire, staring into the embers, thinking about how this life always ends the same way. Not in glory, not in wealth, just cold, alone, hunted. You tell yourself you'll leave, find a different place, maybe even a different life. But you've said that before. The blade always calls you back. Maybe it's the only thing you've ever been good at. Maybe it's the only thing you've ever been allowed to be. The wind picks up, scattering ash into the night. You pull your hood up again and disappear into the dark. One more shadow among many. You walk for days. No destination, no plan, just the endless dirt roads that stretch between towns like scars across the land. Each village looks the same after a while. Crooked houses, tired faces, the smell of smoke and rot clinging to everything. You tell yourself you're laying low, waiting for the trouble to die down. But deep down, you know it never really does. Trouble follows you like a second shadow. You travel mostly at night now. The roads are quieter then, and the darkness is your only friend. Sometimes you hear wolves howling in the distance, or the clatter of hooves when a noble's carriage passes. You always step off the road and wait until it's gone. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The fewer eyes that see you, the longer you live. Eventually, you find work on a merchant's caravan, posing as a guard. It's an easy cover. People assume you've seen battle, and you don't correct them. You keep your hood low, your mouth shut, and your blade close. The merchant doesn't ask questions as long as you swing a sword when needed. Days turn into weeks. The rhythm of the road dulls your thoughts. For a little while, you almost feel normal. You sleep near the campfire, share stale bread with other guards, even laugh once or twice at some terrible joke about goats. But every time someone looks at you too long, your stomach tightens. You can't shake the feeling that they see through you, that they know. One night, while camped near a river, you hear footsteps approaching from behind. Your hand goes straight to your knife, but it's only the merchant, a round man with too much beard and not enough sense. He offers you a drink from his flask and sits beside you. You don't talk much, he says. You shrugged. Silence is safer. He chuckles, staring into the fire. I had a cousin like you once. Fought in the king's army, never came back the same. Said the killing stayed in his head like a song he couldn't stop hearing. He pauses, glancing at you. You got that look, too. You don't answer. He doesn't push it. After a moment, he gets up and walks away, leaving you alone with the firelight flickering across your hands. The song he talked about, yeah, you know it. It plays in the quiet moments, in the spaces between breaths. You can almost hum along. The next morning, the caravan reaches a crossroads. The merchant says he's heading south, but you decide to part ways. Too many faces, too many chances for someone to remember you. You thank him, accept a few coins, and turn east toward the hills. It's colder there, lonelier too. The land becomes rough, wild, full of ruins left from old wars. You find shelter in a crumbling tower overlooking a frozen stream. It's not much, but it keeps the wind off. For the first time in weeks, you sleep deeply. When you wake, there's snow falling outside, thick, silent flakes covering the world in white. You step out, and for a moment, it's almost peaceful. No sounds but your own breathing, no footprints but your own. You wonder if this is what freedom feels like, or maybe it's just another kind of prison then. One afternoon, a rider appears. You spot him from the tower window, a lone figure on a black horse, cloak snapping in the wind. He's too well dressed to be a traveler, too calm to be lost. You know before he even stops that he's here for you. He doesn't shout or draw a weapon, he just waits. That's what makes it worse. You can feel your pulse in your throat. Whoever he is, he's not a bounty hunter. They're never this quiet. You watch for hours, but he doesn't move. Finally, you go down. The snow crunches under your boots as you approach him, hand near your dagger. He lowers his hood. He's older, grey at the temples, eyes sharp and tired. You've been hard to find, he says. His voice is calm, practiced, not threatening but not friendly either. He don't speak. He continues. You've left a trail behind you, a bloody one. I know who you are. Fall. You take a step back. The world seems to narrow until it's just you, him, and the soft whisper of falling snow. I'm not here to arrest you, he says quickly. I'm here to offer you work. That catches you off guard. Work. He nods. You're not the only blade for hire in this world. There are men like us, organized, paid well, protected. We serve those who understand the value of silence. You almost laugh. It sounds too good to be true. But then again, everything that sounds good usually is. He sees the doubt in your face. You've been running long enough. Wouldn't you rather have a place to belong? A cause? You shake your head slowly. I stopped believing in causes a long time ago. Then believe in survival, he says. Because alone, you won't last much longer. You know that. He tosses you a small coin, silver, stamped with a mark you don't recognize. If you change your mind, he says, find the red door in the lower quarter of Prague. Ask for the Brotherhood. And then he rides away, vanishing into the snow as silently as he came. You stand there for a long time, turning the coin over in your hand. It's heavy, real, tempting. You know what it means, a chance to stop running, to have protection, maybe even a roof that doesn't leak, but also a new chain around your neck, another master, another set of rules. You go back to the tower, build a small fire, and stare at the coin until the flames die down. You tell yourself you won't go. You've had enough of orders and lies. But when morning comes, the coin's still in your pocket, and deep down, you already know which road you'll take next. Because no matter how far you run, the shadows always find you. The journey to Prague takes weeks. The roads are half frozen, the wind sharp enough to peel the skin off your face. You travel mostly on foot, keeping to the woods when you can, avoiding towns where your name might still be known. The silver coin never leaves your pocket. Sometimes you touch it just to feel its weight, a reminder that there's still something waiting at the end of this misery. By the time the city's walls rise on the horizon, you're half starved and half dead. Prague isn't like the small towns you've passed. It's alive, smoke curling from chimneys, bells ringing, guards shouting in languages you barely understand. The streets twist and climb like veins through a body that's been beating for centuries. You blend into the crowd, another hooded figure among hundreds. The lower quarter smells like rot, sweat, and old beer. Perfect. You wander until you find it. The red door. Faded paint, cracked hinges, but unmistakable. You hesitate for a heartbeat before knocking. It opens just enough for one eye to appear. Who sent you? A voice demands. You hold up the coin. The door swings open. Inside, it's dim and warm, the air thick with smoke from torches. You're led down a narrow hallway, through another door, and suddenly the world opens up into an underground chamber. Tables, maps, weapons, men and women moving like they've been trained to be invisible, even when standing in plain sight. A man steps forward. He's the rider you met in the snow. "Welcome," he says, his voice softer now. "You found us." You look around. The walls are lined with shelves of scrolls, bottles of ink, strange tools. It feels more like a library than a den of killers. He gestures toward a chair. "Sit, eat." You do, tearing into the bread like you haven't seen food in days. Which, to be fair, you haven't. When you finish, he starts talking. "We're not what the stories say. We don't kill for coin, not just for coin. We serve balance. When kings overreach, when nobles oppress, when corruption rots too deep, we cut it out." You raise an eyebrow. "Sounds like a story for fools who need to feel holy." He smiles faintly. "Maybe, but we survive, and that's more than most can say." He leans closer. "You've lived long enough to know the truth of this world. The church prays, kings lie, and peasants die. We simply act, quietly." You don't answer right away. You're thinking of the faces of the people you've killed, the ones who begged, the ones who didn't have time to. You're not sure any of it could ever be called balance. But then you remember the cold, the hunger, the endless running. Maybe this is the closest thing to safety you'll ever find. So you nod. He claps you on the shoulder. "Then you're one of us now." And just like that, you belong to something again, though whether that's salvation or damnation, you can't tell. The days that follow blur together. Training, observation, silence. You learn their signals, their codes. You learn how to vanish in a crowd, how to strike without leaving a trace, how to blend into any class of society. They give you a new name, a new identity, and burn your old one in a bowl of incense. The past, the leader says, is a luxury you no longer have. At first it feels strange, to kill with purpose instead of desperation, to receive coin and shelter, not just fear, but the faces still come in your dreams. The same rhythm, the breath before the strike, the stillness after. Some nights you wake up gasping, wondering if there's any difference between killing for gold and killing for cause. You're sent on small missions at first. A corrupt merchant in Vienna, a warlord who breaks treaties for sport. Every job has the same promise. This will make the world better. But the world never seems to change. The poor stay poor, the powerful stay powerful, and the blood keeps flowing. You start noticing cracks in the brotherhood too. Arguments behind closed doors, rivalries hidden behind polite words. Some members take extra gold on the side. Others whisper about using their influence to control kings instead of punish them. The man who recruited you seems tired, his eyes heavier each day. One night, you find him sitting alone in the candlelight, staring at an old map. "You ever wonder if we're any different from the men we hunt?" he asks quietly. You say nothing. He sighs. "Maybe we started with good intentions, but intentions don't mean much when your hands are red." You want to tell him he's wrong, that you need to believe in something, but the words stick in your throat. You've seen too much. He stands, straightens his cloak. "There's a job tomorrow. Big one. A duke. Dangerous, but important. I want you there." You nod. It's not like you can say no. That night, you don't sleep. You lie awake, watching the shadows flicker on the ceiling, wondering how many more faces you'll have to forget before you stop being afraid of remembering them. When dawn comes, you dress in silence. The mission waits. You follow your mentor in a small group through the narrow streets, across bridges slick with frost. The city is just waking up, vendors calling out, dogs barking, the smell of smoke rising from chimneys. It all feels too alive for what's about to happen. The Duke's carriage appears at the end of the street, gilded and heavy, escorted by armed guards. You take your position, hiding behind a column. Your pulse is steady. You've done this before, too many times, but as the carriage draws closer, something changes. The man beside you moves too soon. A guard spots him, shouts, steel flashes, Chaos erupts. Screams, horses rearing, blades clashing. You dive forward, finishing the job before anyone can think. The Duke falls, blood pooling on cobblestones. But then you hear it. A voice, familiar, shouting your name, your real name. Again. U-turn. Your mentor, standing frozen, staring at you like he's seen a ghost. And maybe he has. The guards close in. You run, through alleys, across rooftops, over walls. You don't stop until the city is a blur behind you. When you finally collapse in a field miles away, breath ragged, you realize something simple and cruel. No matter what name you take, what cause you serve, you're still just a killer running from his own shadow. You wake up hours later in the same field, the frost melting into your clothes. The sky is gray, and the world feels eerily quiet, like it's waiting for something. For a long time, you just lie there, staring at the clouds, trying to remember when exactly you stopped being human. Maybe it was the first kill, maybe the 10th, or maybe it was the moment you believed that killing could ever make the world right. You push yourself up and look around. There's no road, no sound, no sign of life, just the endless, dead stretch of autumn fields. You're far from Prague now, far from the Brotherhood, far from anything that once meant something. You could keep running, vanish into some village, live under another name, or you could go back and face what you left behind. You laugh quietly at the thought. Facing things isn't what assassins do. You've built a life out of avoiding them. But the truth is, the running is getting harder. Every new name you take feels emptier than the last. Every face you forget leaves another hole that doesn't close. You start walking. The road ahead isn't clear, but you move anyway. That's all you know how to do. The wind picks up, carrying the faint sound of church bells from some distant town. They sound mournful, like a funeral for someone you used to be. Days pass. You steal food when you can, sleep wherever the ground is dry enough. Once, you see a patrol of soldiers in the distance, the banners of Prague. You slip into the woods and wait until they pass. You wonder if they're looking for you, or if the world's already forgotten. Eventually, you find a small monastery by the edge of a forest. Smoke rises from its chimney, and the sound of chanting echoes faintly through the cold air. For a moment, you hesitate. Monks don't ask questions. They feed the hungry and bury the lost. You could stay there, maybe find peace, maybe learn to pray again, but then you catch your reflection in the frozen stream nearby. The hooded figure, eyes hollow, jaw hard. You look like death wearing human skin. No monk could fix that. Still, hunger wins over pride. You walk to the monastery and knock on the heavy wooden door. A small bearded man opens it. His eyes are kind but cautious. "You're cold," he says simply. "Come in." He gives you bread and broth. You eat in silence while he studies you, as if trying to decide whether you're dangerous or broken or both. After a while, he says softly, "You look like a man who's seen too much." You smile without humor. "I've seen enough to last 3 lifetimes." He nods slowly. "And yet you're still here." You glance at the simple cross on the wall. Barely. For the next few days, you stay. You help with chores. You eat. You sleep. You don't talk much, and the monks don't push. It feels almost like peace, fragile, borrowed peace, the kind that doesn't last. Because one morning, you wake up to the sound of horses, voices shouting, steel clanging. You rush outside. The monastery is surrounded, soldiers in Prague colors. They're tearing through the courtyard, demanding something. The bearded monk looks at you, and in his eyes, you see it, understanding. "They're here for you," he says quietly. You shake your head. "I didn't mean to bring this." Cliff places a hand on your shoulder. No one ever means to bring their past, but it always finds its way home. The soldiers push through the gates. You turn to run, but the monk grabs your arm. "Stop," you freeze. "There's nowhere left to go," he says. "At least, not while you're running from yourself." You don't know what he means. Maybe you don't want to, but something in his calmness breaks the fear in you. You draw your dagger and hand it to him. "Then, I guess this doesn't belong to me anymore." He takes it carefully, like it's something sacred instead of something soaked in sin. The soldiers find you moments later. They dragged you away, hands bound, shouting accusations: assassin, traitor, murderer. You don't fight. You don't even speak. You just walk, silent, while the snow starts to fall again. They take you back to Prague, back through the same gates you once entered freely. The city looks different now, colder, emptier. You're thrown into a dungeon, chains biting into your wrists. Days blur into weeks. Sometimes you hear screams from other cells. Sometimes you hear laughter, cruel, distant. You start to lose track of time. The walls close in. The silence grows teeth. But you're not afraid anymore. You've already lived your death 100 times over. One day, the door creaks open. It's him, your old mentor. He looks older, thinner. His eyes are heavy with something you can't name. They said you were dead. He says quietly, I was. You reply. He lets out a breath that sounds halfway between relief and regret. They'll hang you tomorrow. You nod. Seems fair. He studies you for a long time, then shakes his head. You could have been great. You could have changed everything. You smile faintly. Maybe that's the problem. He steps closer, his voice lowering. Tell me, do you regret it? All of it. You look up at him. Regret's a luxury for people who had choices. For a long moment, he just stares at you. Then he turns and walks away. The door closes behind him with a sound that feels final. The next morning, they lead you out into the courtyard. The air is sharp and cold. A crowd has gathered, nobles, peasants, guards, all staring. You keep your head down, the hood shadowing your face. They tie the rope. You don't fight. You don't beg. As the executioner steps forward, you look up at the sky, gray, endless, uncaring. For the first time in years, you feel still. Maybe that's what peace really is. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just the end of running. The trapdoor creaks. Someone shouts the words. The world drops away. And just like that, the story of a medieval assassin ends not with glory or gold, but with silence. Because in truth, it always sucked to be one. The world fades slowly. The noise of the crowd, the cold air, the sharp pain in your neck, all of it slips away like smoke rising into a dark sky. For a moment, you feel weightless. There's no rope, no stone walls, no names, no sins, just a drifting quiet. And in that quiet, the truth finally settles in, not like thunder, but like snow, soft, cold, inevitable. It really did suck to be a medieval assassin. People in taverns loved to tell stories about them, whispering over mugs of ale, painting pictures of hooded figures leaping from rooftops, blades glinting in torchlight, vanishing into the mist. They make it sound glamorous, like being untouchable, like living beyond the reach of kings and laws. But those stories leave out the rot underneath, the hunger, the fear, the way the world turns its back on you the moment you stop being useful. For every target struck in silence, there's a night spent hiding in mud, praying no one finds your name. For every bag of silver, there's another face that won't leave your dreams. And for every promise of freedom, there's another chain waiting somewhere down the line. A chain of secrets, debts, lies, blood. Assassins didn't live in shadow because it was mysterious. They lived there because no one else would have them. They were tools, disposable. A blade doesn't get remembered, only the cut it leaves behind. And if you were one of them, you'd learn that faster than anything, that the world didn't need you to live long. It just needed you to die quietly. Some found faith before the end, some didn't, but none of them ever really escaped what they were made to be. It wasn't about courage, or purpose, or justice. It was survival, pure and simple. And survival in the Middle Ages meant doing things that carved pieces out of you, until there wasn't much left to save. Maybe that's why people still romanticize assassins today, because we like to imagine control in a world that had none. A man in a hood, deciding who lives and dies, sounds powerful, but power in that world was a lie, just another name for the next person who'd get betrayed. The truth is quieter, sadder. Being an assassin meant walking through life unseen, but never untouched. It meant losing your name, your sleep, your humanity, one job at a time. And even if you survived long enough to grow old, which almost none did, your story would die in whispers, rewritten by people who never carried a blade, who never saw the eyes of the ones they killed. You wouldn't be remembered as a man or a woman. You'd be remembered as a legend. And legends, in the end, are just ghosts. People tell stories about to feel brave before they sleep. So, if you ever find yourself dreaming of a medieval world, the castles, the torches, the flicker of steel under moonlight, remember this. Somewhere out there, in those cold stone streets, someone like you was walking under a hood, clutching a dagger, wishing they could just stop running. Not for glory, not for gold, just to rest. And maybe, finally, that's what the quiet after death really was for them. Not punishment, not forgiveness, just rest. Because in a world built on secrets and shadows, peace was the one thing an assassin never got to kill for. So sleep easy tonight, friend. You're warm, safe, and no one's chasing you through cobbled streets. And if you dream of hoods and daggers and candlelight flickering on stone, well, maybe that's just some long-forgotten ghost wandering by, finally finding the silence he'd been running from all along. Good night.